The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in March 1979. It was thin, official, and bore no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 12 lines of typed text. At the bottom, a signature Thomas had never seen before. The letter informed him that his father's textile mill, which had employed 230 workers in the town of Millbrook for 43 years, now belonged to Consolidated Maritime Trust. The debt, accumulated over 18 months of delayed loan payments during the recession, had been called in full. The building, the machines, the inventory, the family home used as collateral, everything was now property of the bank. Thomas was 17 years old. He read the letter 3 times before walking upstairs to tell his father. His father, Benjamin Harrow, sat in the study where he had worked every evening for as long as Thomas could remember. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather. Benjamin was 51, a man who had built his business with his hands, who knew every worker by name, who had never missed a payroll in 4 decades. When Thomas handed him the letter, Benjamin's face did not change. He read it slowly, folded it once, and placed it on the desk between them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Benjamin said, "They didn't even send someone to deliver it in person." His voice was quiet, almost gentle, as if he were observing something distant and inevitable, like the change of seasons. 3 weeks later, Benjamin Harrow walked into his mill for the last time. It was a Sunday. The building was empty, the machines silent. He stood in the center of the factory floor for 20 minutes, looking at the looms his grandfather had installed in 1936, the cutting tables his father had commissioned in 1952, the office where Thomas had learned to read balance sheets at age 12. Then he went home, climbed the stairs to his bedroom, and took a bottle of pills he had been saving since the heart surgery 2 years prior. He left no note. Thomas found him the next morning. The funeral was attended by 163 people, workers from the mill, their families, neighbors who had known the Harrows for generations. The priest spoke about dignity and faith. Thomas stood at the front of the church and felt nothing. Not sadness, not anger, just a hollow space where something used to be. After the service, a man in a grey suit approached him outside the church. He introduced himself as a representative from Consolidated Maritime Trust. He expressed condolences. He explained that the foreclosure process would continue as scheduled and that Thomas had 30 days to vacate the family home. He handed Thomas a business card and walked away. That night, Thomas sat in his father's study and opened the filing cabinet where Benjamin had kept all the business records. He found the original loan documents from 1977. The terms were clear: a 5-year commercial loan at 9.5% interest, secured against the mill and the Harrow family home. The payments had been manageable until the recession hit. In late 1978, orders dried up. 3 major clients declared bankruptcy. Benjamin had gone to the bank in November of that year to request a 6-month payment deferral. He had been banking with Consolidated Maritime Trust for 22 years. He had never missed a payment. The bank manager, a man named Gerald Moss, had assured him it would be no problem. Benjamin left that meeting believing he had bought time to stabilize the business. What Thomas discovered in the files was that Gerald Moss had lied. There was no deferral. Instead, Moss had reclassified the loan as high risk and initiated a quiet foreclosure process. For 6 months, while Benjamin believed he had an agreement, the bank was preparing to seize everything. The delayed payments were recorded as defaults, penalty interest was added, legal fees were accumulated. By the time the letter arrived in March, the debt had ballooned from $87,000 to $142,000. Benjamin never had a chance. The bank had decided to take the mill the moment he walked into that November meeting. Thomas was 17, but he understood what he was reading. This was not a business failure. This was not bad luck. This was deliberate. Consolidated Maritime Trust had looked at a struggling textile mill in a small town and seen an opportunity. The building alone was worth $300,000. The land it sat on, positioned near the new highway interchange, was worth even more. Benjamin Harrow was not a bad businessman. He was an asset to be liquidated, and Gerald Moss, the man who had shaken his hand every month for 22 years, had been the instrument of that liquidation. Thomas closed the files and sat in the darkness of his father's study. He thought about the pills his father had taken. He thought about the 163 people at the funeral. He thought about the man in the grey suit who had handed him a business card 30 feet from his father's grave. And he made a decision. He would not fight the foreclosure. He would not hire a lawyer or file an appeal or beg for mercy. He would do something else. He would learn. He would become what they were. And then, when he was ready, he would take from them what they had taken from him. The plan began with patience. Thomas moved out of the family home on the 28th day, 2 days before the deadline. He took nothing but his clothes, his father's files, and a single photograph of his mother, who had died when he was 9. He found a room above a hardware store on the edge of town and took a job washing dishes at a diner on Route 7. He worked 50 hours a week and saved every dollar he did not need for rent and food. At night, he studied. He read books on finance, banking, corporate law, investment strategy. He taught himself accounting, securities trading, monetary policy. He had no formal education beyond high school, but he had something more valuable. He had a reason. For 3 years, Thomas worked and studied. He watched the mill from a distance. Consolidated Maritime Trust sold it 6 months after the foreclosure to a development company for $410,000. The building was demolished. A shopping plaza was built in its place. Gerald Moss received a promotion. Thomas noted all of this in a leather journal he kept in his room. He wrote down names, dates, transactions, patterns. He was building a map of how the bank operated, who made decisions, where the vulnerabilities were. He was 17 when his father died. He was 20 when he left Millbrook for the first time. He moved to Philadelphia with $11,000 in savings and a plan that existed only in his mind. He enrolled in night classes at Temple University, studying finance and business administration. During the day, he worked as a clerk at a mid-sized investment firm called Whitmore and Associates. His job was to file documents, answer phones, and make coffee. But he watched everything. He learned how deals were structured, how capital flowed, how institutions made money not by creating value, but by positioning themselves between transactions. He learned the language of leverage, arbitrage, and risk assessment. And he learned that banks like Consolidated Maritime Trust were not untouchable. They were machines, and machines could be broken if you understood how they worked. By 1984, Thomas had completed his degree and moved to a junior analyst position at Whitmore and Associates. He was good at his work, methodical, detail-oriented, invisible. He never drew attention to himself. He never made mistakes. He watched senior partners execute complex financial maneuvers and absorbed the mechanics of corporate warfare. He learned how hostile takeovers were orchestrated, how shell companies were used to obscure ownership, how debt could be weaponized to destroy competitors. He was 23 years old, and he had not forgotten his father's face the day he read that letter. In 1986, Thomas left Whitmore and Associates and joined a boutique hedge fund called Sentinel Capital. The fund specialized in distressed assets, buying failing companies at deep discounts and either restructuring them for profit or liquidating them for parts. It was ruthless work, and Thomas excelled at it. He had no emotional attachment to the businesses they dismantled. He saw them as his father's bank had seen his father, as numbers on a page, as opportunities to extract value. He was learning their language, their logic, their cruelty, and he was getting very, very good at it. By 1990, at age 28, Thomas had accumulated enough capital and reputation to leave Sentinel and form his own investment vehicle. He called it Northway Holdings. It was a small operation, just Thomas and 2 junior analysts, but it was his. He specialized in identifying undervalued regional banks, particularly those with exposure to commercial real estate in declining industrial towns. He would analyze their portfolios, identify weaknesses, and either short their stock or acquire positions that gave him leverage over their operations. He made money, not a fortune, but enough to grow. And all the while, he kept one file separate from the others. A file labeled CMT, Consolidated Maritime Trust. For 12 years, Thomas had been studying the bank that killed his father. He knew its executive structure, its board composition, its loan portfolio, its exposure to regional economic shifts. He knew that Consolidated Maritime Trust had grown aggressively throughout the 1980s, acquiring smaller community banks and expanding into commercial real estate lending. He knew that this growth was funded by short-term debt, and that the bank's balance sheet was more fragile than it appeared. He knew that Gerald Moss, the man who had lied to his father, was now the bank's executive vice president of regional lending, and he knew that if the right pressures were applied at the right time, the entire structure could collapse. The opportunity came in 1993. The commercial real estate market in the Northeast was softening. Several major developers were struggling with over-leveraged projects. Consolidated Maritime Trust held significant exposure to these loans. Thomas began quietly acquiring distressed real estate debt from other institutions, debt that was tied to properties in CMT's lending territory. He used shell companies to obscure his involvement. He bought at steep discounts from banks that wanted to clear their books. Over 18 months, he accumulated positions in 47 separate loans, all of them connected in one way or another to Consolidated Maritime Trust's portfolio. Then he waited. In early 1995, one of the largest developers in the region, a company called Hartfield Properties, missed a payment on a major project financed by CMT. It was not a catastrophic default, just a missed payment, but it triggered a review. Thomas knew this would happen. He had been waiting for it. 3 weeks after the missed payment, Northway Holdings contacted Hartfield's creditors and offered to buy their distressed debt at a premium. Most accepted. Within 60 days, Thomas owned enough of Hartfield's obligations to control the restructuring process. What happened next was a masterclass in financial demolition. Thomas, through Northway Holdings, declared Hartfield in default and demanded immediate repayment of all obligations. Hartfield, unable to pay, filed for bankruptcy protection. This sent shockwaves through the regional real estate market. Other developers, seeing Hartfield collapse, began to panic. Several preemptively sought to renegotiate their own loans. Consolidated Maritime Trust, which had lent aggressively to these same developers, suddenly found itself with a portfolio full of distressed assets. The bank's stock price began to slide. Thomas was not done. Using his network of contacts, he began quietly spreading concerns about CMT's exposure to the collapsing real estate market. He did not lie. He simply highlighted facts that were already public but largely ignored. He spoke to analysts, journalists, other investors. He asked questions in earnings calls. He filed information requests. He was a ghost, never directly attacking, just illuminating weaknesses. The pressure built slowly, like water, seeping into cracks in a foundation. In August of 1995, a regional business journal published an investigative piece on Consolidated Maritime Trust's loan portfolio. The article raised questions about the bank's risk management practices and its exposure to the failing real estate sector. The bank's stock dropped 12% in 2 days. The board called an emergency meeting. Gerald Moss, as the executive overseeing the troubled loan portfolio, was tasked with presenting a recovery plan. He had 48 hours to prepare. Thomas knew this because he had cultivated a source inside the bank, a junior risk analyst who was frustrated with the institution's leadership and who believed the bank was heading toward disaster. The analyst fed Thomas internal memos, risk assessments, and details of board discussions. Thomas learned that Moss's recovery plan involved selling off distressed assets at a loss and tightening lending standards. It was a reasonable plan, but it required time and investor confidence. Thomas was about to destroy both. On the day before Moss was scheduled to present his plan to the board, Northway Holdings announced that it was filing suit against Consolidated Maritime Trust for alleged breach of fiduciary duty in the Hartfield Properties restructuring. The suit claimed that CMT had colluded with other lenders to artificially suppress asset values, harming minority creditors like Northway. The claim was legally thin, but that did not matter. What mattered was the headline, "Hedge Fund Sues Regional Bank Over Real Estate Collapse." The story ran in every major business publication. CMT's stock dropped another 15%. The board panicked. Moss's recovery plan was shelved. Instead, the board voted to seek an emergency merger with a larger institution to stabilize the bank and restore investor confidence. Negotiations began with several potential acquirers, but Thomas had anticipated this too. Through a network of proxies, he had quietly acquired a small but significant percentage of CMT's publicly traded shares, not enough to control the bank, but enough to complicate any merger. When potential acquirers conducted due diligence, they found Northway Holdings listed among the top 20 shareholders. They asked questions. Who was this fund? What were its intentions? Why was it suing the bank while also holding its stock? The uncertainty killed the merger talks. One by one, potential acquirers walked away, unwilling to inherit the mess. By October of 1995, Consolidated Maritime Trust was in freefall. Its stock had lost 60% of its value. Major clients were pulling deposits. Federal regulators were circling. And Gerald Moss, the man who had assured Benjamin Harrow that everything would be fine, was fired by the board in a desperate attempt to appease investors. Thomas watched all of this from his office in Philadelphia. He felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, just the cold fulfillment of a process he had set in motion 16 years earlier. But he was not finished. The bank was wounded, but it was not dead. He needed one more push. In November of 1995, Northway Holdings made a public offer to buy Consolidated Maritime Trust's most valuable remaining asset, a portfolio of performing commercial loans worth approximately $120 million. The offer was deliberately low, 50 cents on the dollar, but it came with a condition. The sale had to close within 30 days, or the offer would be withdrawn. The bank was trapped. It needed capital immediately to meet regulatory requirements, but no other buyers were willing to move that quickly. The board voted to accept the offer. The sale closed on December 18, 1995. Consolidated Maritime Trust received $60 million, barely enough to stabilize its reserves. Northway Holdings took ownership of a loan portfolio that included obligations from some of the most stable businesses in the region. Thomas had just acquired, at a massive discount, the core assets that had once made CMT a powerful institution. 3 weeks later, Consolidated Maritime Trust was absorbed by a larger bank in a distressed acquisition. The CMT brand disappeared. Its executives were let go. Its branches were rebranded. The bank that had killed Benjamin Harrow ceased to exist. Thomas sat in his office on a cold January morning in 1996 and opened the leather journal he had started keeping in 1979. He turned to the first page, where he had written his father's name and the date of his death. Below that, he had written a single sentence: "They will pay for what they did." He picked up a pen and drew a single line through the words. Then he closed the journal and placed it in a drawer. He never looked at it again. But the story did not end there. In the months following the collapse of Consolidated Maritime Trust, Thomas began receiving letters. They came from former employees of the bank, from families in Millbrook, from people who had lost their homes, their businesses, their savings to CMT's predatory practices. They had read about the bank's collapse in the newspapers. They had seen Northway Holdings' name in the reports. Some of them remembered Benjamin Harrow. Some of them remembered the textile mill. They were writing to thank Thomas, to tell him their own stories, to say that what he had done mattered. Thomas read every letter. He responded to none of them. He had not destroyed Consolidated Maritime Trust for them. He had done it for a 17-year-old boy who had found his father dead and received a business card at the funeral. But reading the letters, he began to understand something he had not anticipated. Revenge, even intelligent revenge, even revenge executed with precision and patience over 2 decades, did not fill the hollow space his father's death had created. It did not bring Benjamin back. It did not restore the mill or the 230 jobs or the life Thomas might have lived if that letter had never arrived. What it did do was prove a point, that institutions are not invincible, that systems built on cruelty and extraction can be dismantled by those they underestimate. That a 17-year-old boy with no money, no power, and no connections could learn their language, enter their world, and take everything from them without them ever knowing his name until it was too late. Gerald Moss, the man who had signed the foreclosure order and shaken Benjamin's hand for 22 years, never knew that Thomas Harrow was the architect of his ruin. He never connected the hedge fund manager who sued the bank to the teenage boy who had stood outside the church in March of 1979. He lost his job, his reputation, and his pension, and he never understood why. Thomas made sure of that. Because the cruelest revenge is not violence or confrontation. It is to be destroyed by someone you never saw coming, for reasons you never understood, in a language you thought you spoke but never truly did. Thomas Harrow continued to run Northway Holdings for another 12 years. He made a fortune, not through luck or inheritance, but through the same ruthless logic that Consolidated Maritime Trust had once used against his father. He bought distressed assets, dismantled failing companies, extracted value from desperation. He became what he had studied, what he had hated, what he had needed to become to achieve his goal. And in doing so, he lost something he could never name. In 2008, at age 46, Thomas sold Northway Holdings and disappeared from the financial world. He did not retire to a mansion or a yacht. He moved to a small town in Vermont, far from Philadelphia, far from Millbrook, far from the life he had built in the shadow of his father's death. He lived alone in a house at the end of a dirt road. He did not give interviews or write memoirs or seek recognition for what he had done. He simply stopped. On March 14, 2001, 22 years to the day after his father received the foreclosure letter, Thomas drove to Millbrook for the first time since he was 17. The textile mill was long gone. In its place stood a half-empty shopping plaza with a discount grocery store and a dollar store. The Harrow family home had been torn down and replaced with a small office building. Thomas parked his car and walked through the town. He recognized almost nothing. The diner, where he had washed dishes, was closed. The hardware store where he had rented a room was now a cell phone shop. The church where his father's funeral had been held was still there, but the priest was long retired, and the congregation was a fraction of what it once was. Thomas stood outside the church for a long time. He thought about the man in the grey suit who had handed him a business card. He thought about the letters he had received from strangers thanking him for destroying the bank. He thought about the leather journal sitting in a drawer 200 miles away. And he realized that the revenge he had executed so perfectly, so methodically, over 2 decades, had not saved him. It had not healed him. It had simply given him something to do while the years passed and the wound remained. He got back in his car and drove away. He never returned to Millbrook again. And for the rest of his life, whenever anyone asked him what he did for a living, he would say he used to work in finance, but that he was retired now. He never mentioned Consolidated Maritime Trust. He never mentioned his father. He never mentioned the 22 years he spent learning how to destroy a bank that did not know his name. Because in the end, the most devastating victories are the ones that no one remembers, the ones that change nothing except the life of the person who fought for them, the ones that prove that justice and revenge are not the same thing, and that sometimes the price of taking everything from your enemies is realizing that you have nothing left to take from yourself. The shopping plaza still stands in Millbrook. The office building that replaced the Harrow home still houses a small accounting firm and a real estate agency. And somewhere in a drawer in Vermont, in a house at the end of a dirt road, there is a leather journal with a single sentence crossed out. They will pay for what they did pay, and so did he.